I'd like to sort of kick us off by sort of thinking about food and what we mean when we say food security, because obviously we're not in any danger of being cut off by U-boats anymore. We're not thinking about food security in those terms, but we have had to think about food and where our food comes from over the last few years. So we thought about it a bit during the pandemic when the pasta disappeared from the shelves, and then we stopped thinking about it when the pasta came back onto the shelves. And then we're thinking about it again through the Ukraine crisis. And I think the Ukraine crisis is making us think about it in a really interesting way, because it's making us think about our relationship with fossil fuels, our relationship with Russia and Russian gas, particularly if you're in Germany and thinking about what it's going to be like this winter, warming up your home, but also our relationship with fossil fuels and agriculture, and how big a part artificial fertilizer plays in farming, and what the impact is going to be of the problems getting grain out of Russia and the Ukraine on the world. So Henry, if I can start with you. Henry, co-founder of Leon, author of a brilliant report on food. Could you just set the scene for us and tell us sort of how we got here, how we got to a situation where you know, we have very affordable food, huge quantities of it, but we're increasingly uncomfortable with some of the sort of hidden costs of that food. And some of those costs are cost nutritionally, some of those costs are costs environmentally, but really sort of starting to stack up. You know, how do we get to this point over the last few decades?
Sure. So, I mean, food security actually is at the heart of the story of why we have the food system that we do. In the National Food Strategy, the report that I wrote for government, we described the food system as a miracle and a disaster. And it's important to realise that it was a miracle. So after the Second World War, when we, interesting in this country, had gone before the war, we produced 30% of our food because of the U-boat threat. We dug up fields. We actually, the government paid people to move from inefficient meat production to vegetable production. And by the end of the war, we had 70% food security. We grew 70% of our own food. But at that time, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet, and the population of the planet was predicted to grow to about 9 billion over the next 100 years. And throughout the whole course of human history before that, when the population had grown, we'd simply dug up more land and grown more food on that land. But that wasn't going to be possible for that many people. You know, there would just be that, you know, we dug up all the land. There was no more land to dig up. And so if you look back to the newspaper front pages in the kind of early 50s, this Malthusian threat, the idea that mankind would not be able to feed itself, you know, it was regularly front page news. And the response to that was to create the food system that we have today. And at the heart of that was a man called Norman Borlaug, who was a botanist from Idaho who had grown up during the Great Depression and seen real food poverty, seen food riots, and had set about, you know, thinking that his whole life mission was going to be to turn around, you know, to feed people. He went to Mexico during the war. He wrote back to his wife that the conditions there were so horrific, the people were so poor, the soil was so poor that it clubbed his mind. And he said, I don't know what we do, but we have to do something. And what he did was he developed the short-stemmed, high-yielding wheat rust-resistant wheat that is now the staple of all our wheat crops. And Mexico went from being importing half its wheat to, by the 60s, being self-sufficient in wheat. And that experiment was repeated with maize and rice and linked to nitrogen fertilizer produced using the Haber-Bosch process and modern irrigation techniques, means that we now produce, although they were right, we did, you know, we have 7.8 billion people now, but we now produce, from actually slightly less land, 1.7 times the amount of food that we did back then. The food quantity is not a problem, it's a problem of distribution. There have been no famines this century, it's been riots and wars and political disturbance that causes hunger.
And it is a really significant achievement that we've had no famines, you know, since the Green Revolution.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It is. And, but what we didn't realise was that that system has created two other huge problems. So the food system is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse, of freshwater scarcity, of deforestation, of the emptying of the oceans, alongside energy. It is one of the two big causes of climate change, and it's also the biggest cause of avoidable disease, of non-communicable disease. And so we now have a system where we solved all of those problems, but we have probably, you know, two of the 3 or 4 biggest problems of developed worlds is now created by the food system. So we have to use the same ingenuity actually to create another food system that doesn't look like the one we have today, because the one we have today is not sustainable for our health or for the environment.
So when we look at our sort of supermarkets and restaurants full of food and full of food at affordable prices, it doesn't look like there's a problem there, does it? But I hear over and over again that the food system is broken. And what do we mean when we say that, Henry?
Well, so on the environmental side, first of all, if you look at climate change, the food system, which creates 20 to 30% of the world's greenhouse gases, is actually its own biggest enemy. So if you look at the forecast of where food is going to be able to be produced with climate change, actually you see in the temperate zone, in the northern hemisphere, because we will have warmer, wetter weather and there's more carbon dioxide in the air, wheat yields will probably go up. If you see a map of this, it's kind of big green strip across the northern hemisphere. Rice and maize yields in the southern hemisphere and along the equator are going to fall dramatically. And whenever I see that map, it looks to me like mass immigration or war. It's an absolutely terrifying map. And that is what will happen if we don't have sustainable food growing on the environmental side. On the health side, the NHS in this country predicts that it's going to spend as much in 2035 on curing type 2 diabetes, which is one condition caused by eating the wrong food, as it does on all cancers today. It is going to, it won't knock over the NHS, it will suck the spending out of all other parts of society. Mm-hmm. So we simply won't be able to go on there. People say, will people have the political will to change anything? And the answer is the food system is unsustainable, which literally means it will change. The question is, to what state will we leave the environment in by the time we decide to act, and how much harm will we do to people's health before we act?
Right. I should say at this point that this isn't like a traditional one of these conversations where the panelists speak and then we come to you, the audience, at the end. We do want to hear from you throughout. So if you have comments, if there are things that you want to add to this conversation, please just catch my eye. That's very, very quick. But yes, let's bring you in. And do you have a mic, sir? Is there a mic near you? Well, I can get you we can get you a mic.
You can have my mic.
There's a mic right here. We can pass that back to you. There we go.
Do I need to introduce myself?
Please do, yeah.
I'm Chris Van Tulloch and I'm an academic at UCL. Henry, you just said we're using less land than we were pre-war or before the Green Revolution. Why have we cut down so much tropical forest in that case?
Okay, let's come to this point a bit later. Okay. So let me just we'll gather some more comments and then come back. I will allow one question on Harry Potter, but no more than that. But the lady with her hand there, can we get you the mic as well? If you could just wait until the mic comes over.
Thank you. I just wanted to underline what you were saying, Henry, by adding that the figures that we work to, which have come at multilateral UN level, are 30,000 deaths a day. So the food system is the biggest killer in the world. So we agree with everything you're saying. I just wanted to please remember that number. 30,000 deaths a day, the biggest killer in the world. This is really important stuff.
Okay, and we have one hand raised at the front and then Catherine as well at the back. Catherine.
Hi. Would we not like to change the narrative? Yes, indeed, over 90% of the population in the world are eating rice, maize and wheat, but do we not want to think about the amazing 70,000 plants that we could eat, different food sources that we could eat, and just have that radical approach to change the narrative that we should only look at those as the main sources of food in the way that we look at them. We look at food security. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. And I'm just to say one more comment. There was a girl in dungarees at the front, was there? Or maybe there wasn't. No, there wasn't. Okay, fine. Then we'll come back to deforestation and the great question on the diversity of food sources. But first, let me come to you, Bonnie. So let's just think about this from a sort of climate perspective, and tell me a bit about how you got into this. It was through a climate lens, wasn't it, that you got into the food question?
Yeah, I definitely got into the subject of the food system through the climate justice kind of lens, and just, realizing the more and more you look into each of these kind of layers of kind of the climate crisis, the more obviously interwoven they all become, and like there's more clear, obvious kind of connections between them. But I think while it is devastating hearing all the facts that we just heard, what I personally find on an individual level with my relationship to food or my friends or community or just what I'm seeing is that there are actually incredible ways that we can connect with it in our day-to-day lives, where there are some other subjects in the climate crisis that feel so totally out of our reach. And to me, that's what excites me about this issue, even though it terrifies me at the same time, whether that's the simple thing of diverting my food waste from a landfill and composting that instead. That's like one small, simple act. And going further on that, not just looking at the individual, but how do I make sure that everyone across this country has the easy access to divert that food waste to compost. So on that kind of individual and policy way, making sure that everyone has a fair, just access that makes it convenient, because we do live in a world where we have got to the point where everything, unless it isn't convenient or we're incentivized to do it, it is hard to make people do it because we have 1,000,001 things to get done in that day, and people are under so many pressures from other elements in their life. So I think from the climate justice element and how I really like to look at everything, which is really the kind of the tone that I take to my book, Go Gently, which is, you know, you can either to direct our gaze essentially towards the positive solutions that exist, and the community, people in communities now who are already championing great solutions that they're doing from direct experiences of what's affecting them in their neighborhood, and really looking to those people and asking what they need and what they want to make sure they have better access to make healthier choices for not just themselves, but, you know, for their community, for the country, for, you know, how they're going to leave the kind of lands around them for the next generations.
I want to kind of think about this question in the course of the evening of what does food security mean for us in the UK, because I think that food security probably doesn't mean are we afraid that we're going to run out of food, although that is always a question that we have to think about. I think it means much more kind of how do we feed ourselves sustainably in a way that has less impact on the environment, what should be on our plates. And I think this comes to what you were saying, Bonnie, about food being an area where we feel we have some agency, where we can play a part, we can make choices, we can make a difference. I think it's quite important to feel that people have that power. So if you, when you sort of begin to think about that in your own life and the lives of people around you, what are the things that you're sort of thinking about in terms of choices and in terms of sustainable choices?
Well, I think obviously kind of talking about that convenience element, like if there is not close access to, you know, choose whole ingredients of vegetables and fruit, if that needs to be easier than picking up kind of, you know, a soda can or a, you know, sweets and crisps. Like the access to that needs to be fair. Like I know that the experience I've had with my privilege and access to food is a totally different direct experience that someone else could have in this country. So it's realizing that, like beyond us, like what are other people's situations, and so yeah, I think it's about making things the baseline that is healthy, not that that's a reach to get to, that is just the baseline and the new kind of status quo of how we're living. And just really looking at where the root of the problem is, rather than, you know, the need for the NHS to come in and, you know, put all this funding into helping people when it's kind of too late. Like, how are we going back to a root cause of, like, education? Even if I think about my education at a primary level here in the UK, while I loved it and it was great, I probably definitely could have had a lot more to do with learning how to go to the supermarket and budget my week's food and actually buy whole ingredients and not processed packaged foods. How could I really learn about the food system, why I needed even like a biodiverse, even like plate looking back at me and not just kind of beige food looking back at me or whatever that could be. Like seeing even in my own life where there were gaps in my education. And I've only come to learn this because I've been interested in it and I'm curious about it. And I'm not one person. There are so many people in my generation and younger who are really fascinated by growing their own food, by understanding or switching to a more plant-based lifestyle. Like, people are interested. It's not like we're not having to kind of convince people. I think we're just having to help and guide people. Yeah,
it is a bit of an unsettling moment, isn't it, when you begin thinking about what's on your plate and how it got there. I sort of wish I could stop thinking about that sometimes. It's much easier. I'd like to come to Christina on this point, because we were talking earlier about choices and the choices that people have available to them. Do you want to just tell us? Should we get you a mic? Do we have one? And we can grab yours. Thank you. Oh, you're good.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of what you said. Being a young person, I'm 18,
Could you hold the mic a bit closer, Christine? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
I'm not sure that one's working. I'll give you this one, yeah.
Okay, that's better. So I'm a young person. I'm founding chair of Bite Back 2030, a youth-led movement aiming to fight the injustices of the food industry in the UK. I was saying that I resonate with a lot of what Bonnie said, particularly with the kind of lack of choice. We at Bite Back don't use the word choice because we feel like young people don't have a choice in what we eat. We are, bombarded from a very young age, with junk food marketing. I grew up in a food desert and I didn't even know about it until I joined Bite Back. So again, like the fact that you have to be interested and curious to even know what's going on around you is kind of insane, because you really do have to go out of your way to understand, and for young people that's just simply not a possibility. If you're from a lower income family, you live in a food desert, you have little to no access to nutritious, affordable food. It's a whole system that's kind of rigged against you, and so how can you talk about choice?
And Christine, I know that some people in the room are experts and are aware of what food desert means, but could you just explain in terms of your own experience, what did that mean?
Yeah, so I live in South London, and on my high street you can see loads of variations of the same kind of junk food, but little to no access to nutritious food. And so I go to school in Westminster, so that walk to school from South London to I used to go to school in Westminster, I just finished. Anyway, so when I would walk over the bridge, I would suddenly have access to loads of amazing options, amazing different variations of healthy food, but it would just not be in my price range. So as young people, we want to explore what food can be, the potential of healthy food, but the way it's marketed to us, the lack of access, geographical immobility, it's all kind of, and junk food marketing, it's all stacked against us. And even when we do try to eat healthy, this is one of our recent campaigns, we are misled by what is healthy, and food labelling is just, it's not truthful and it's not transparent. So there's a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Victoria, I'd like to turn to you and ask you about the question of food security. I mean, that's obviously kind of, an essential responsibility of government, isn't it? Making sure that food is available. Tell us what the concept of food security you think means from a Westminster perspective.
Well, I think it means something a bit different today to what it meant even a year ago. I think you're right. In the pandemic, we all learnt what running out of loo roll looked like on the shelves. I know loo roll isn't food, but you get the picture.
It felt like it at times, didn't it? Yeah.
Well, the sort of national conversation around shortage was not something that had ever happened in our lifetimes before that. So that was one wake-up call, which is good. That was one of the good things, in my view, to come out of the pandemic. People took food and the availability of food much, much more seriously, and it went very much higher up the political agenda than it ever had before. It's always been very high up my own agenda because I'm very greedy. So I was always very happy to wonder about where the next meal was coming from, but that probably wasn't the case in the rest of Westminster. And I think Henry, not that he's very greedy, but he and I were slightly fighting a bit of a battle to get other people to take food as seriously as we do. And then, of course, the war happened. Yeah. And suddenly the whole world was talking about food security in a very different light. Previously, we'd often talked about food security meaning food affordability as well, which is another whole conversation that I'm very happy to go down if we've got time. But for me, the war has meant several different things. One is on the very personal level. We've had a lovely young lady called Vika living with us since March from Ukraine. Her family traditionally farm in Ukraine, and we're able sometimes to talk to them on the phone. And she's taught me many things, one of which talking to members of her family who are in occupation, is that food is actively being used as a weapon at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that that isn't just in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The weaponization of food across the whole globe by this particular Russian act of aggression is really serious. And I have just come back. I spent last weekend in Berlin at the G7 talking about how to get that grain out of Ukraine and what the implications are for hunger, particularly in Africa, if we are unable to do that, both in the short term and the longer term, and what planning the world can do to mitigate the effects of war. And I think these are not conversations I ever expected to have.
Absolutely not.
And it's made us question lots and lots of things about the way we eat and the way we grow. I'm a farmer originally. That are going to affect many, many decisions on the tiny level that farmers and food producers are making all the time. So I feel really lucky in this country. I feel really lucky that I'm the Minister of Food in a country where we grow 74% of what we can grow, that we eat, that we have really good, in the traditional sense of the word, food security. And while I totally accept that there is much, much more we need to do in the availability, the affordability, the labelling, the transparency, the sustainability, all of the things that Christina and others have said, we at least have food available to us.
I just want to stay on that question. You've pointed to the fact that in Africa and the Middle East, we might be seeing a really devastating situation as the year unfolds, really, in terms of food availability. But we also...
And we are already, in fact, in Somaliland, if we're honest. There are already very clear effects of the war, because grain prices have increased and food, therefore, has become less affordable. It's happening. Yeah,
but to bring us, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, but to bring us back to the UK, what is the food vulnerability in the UK? Because we do still import a lot of food, don't we?
Yeah,
a lot of our vegetables, most of our fruit.
We have really good food security, and that, in the traditional sense of the term. So we grow 82% of our wheat, 87% of our grain, pretty self-sufficient in liquid milk, eggs, a lot of the meat that we in fact grow 110% of our lamb, for example. Where we are weak is in veg in particular. 55% of our veg is grown here. And fruit, particularly irritating to me. I was brought up on a plum farm. We grow 16% of our fruit. And those are areas that the government is looking to target with this new horticulture strategy, and areas where we really need to improve. It's not just that we're being jingoistic or Little Englander about this, or I don't think it is at all. It is genuinely that local food is often more environmental, not always, and certainly supply chains are often better when they are shorter, and transparency is always a good thing in a supply chain, I think. Yeah. So there is a real argument for wanting to grow quite a lot of things here. Having said that, trade is also important, and if we're looking at food security in the real macro sense of the word, it is quite important. We're only as good as our last harvest as farmers. It's quite important that we do spread this risk a bit, and we do import from abroad as well. So we're really lucky here. We grow very well here, and we have good supply chains for the rest. So I do feel that compared with many of the other ag ministers I talk to, we are a very fortunate place to be at the moment.
Okay. I want to keep on the point about what we eat and what we should be eating with you, Henry, but there was a hand raised in the audience, a comment from... Yep. Can we get you a mic? Yep.
Hi, Alex Kenny from the British Heart Foundation. So Bonnie made a really good point about privilege and the potential inequalities that stem from the lack of privilege. But too often, government policies around our food environment rely on personal responsibility, which doesn't lead to equitable outcomes. So taking salt, for example, from the British Heart Foundation, obviously, it causes high blood pressure, which is linked to half of heart attack and stroke in the UK. But up to 85% of the salt we consume is already in the food at the point of purchase. So it's not about changing behaviour. Henry, you suggested a levy on salt and sugar, which government hasn't yet committed to. But how else can we get industry to take food improvement seriously?
Okay, let's come on to industry's responsibility in a second. Let me just take one more comment from the lady in front of you. Yep.
Hello. I've got a related question, which is, I feel like the missing word in this debate is how can the UK feed itself well?
Yeah.
And we've skirted around this, and I think every panellist has touched on this. But I guess building on what you said about disparities and inequalities, I'm mindful that the government white paper on health and disparities is coming up. And I think one thing that I think a lot of campaigners in this room and experts and young people would really like to see in that white paper is putting healthier options in the spotlight. So making sure that young people aren't bombarded by junk food, as you said, Christina. So I'm just wondering, perhaps if we can expect any commitments around that policy in particular.
Okay, really interesting questions on health and choice and the role of government. Let's come on to them in a minute, but let's first address Chris's question from earlier on deforestation and the export of harms, Henry. What's your, how do we factor that into our food system, and how should we be thinking of that in our food system?
I think Chris's question was how come there's less land used when we're deforesting the Amazon at a great rate, and in fact parts of Australia are still being deforested to rear cattle. The answer to that's about marginal land. So there's a lot of marginal land that was in food production, which isn't now, particularly in Russia. There are vast swathes of the Russian continent that aren't being farmed, that were being farmed, because it's just not worth it. The soil isn't good enough. But I do think the question about how we think about our impact on the world is very important. One of the things the government has not done is address the trade issue. So at the moment, the government is actually doing a lot of good stuff on trying to create a better food system in this country. But there is nothing to stop us importing food from abroad that is either harmful to animals or harmful to the environment. Therefore, we kind of export those harms abroad. We create a kind of utopian situation in this country, and we export those harms abroad. It doesn't make any sense at all. Interestingly, there was a leaked copy of the government's food strategy that they announced Monday before last, where there were much stronger measures on trade in that leaked copy, and they had come out by the Monday when the actual thing was published. My guess is, and maybe Mr. Prentis will be able to enlighten us.
I've never, ever in my entire 30 years in Whitehall commented on a leaked document. I'm not going to start now, Henry.
My guess is there was a massive arm wrestle between the Department for International Trade and DEFRA, and that DEFRA lost, probably went to the Prime Minister, those things do, and right around. So when these documents get done, they go around Whitehall and everyone passively aggressively changes the text. And if they can't agree, it goes to number 10. So trade is a big issue, it's a big problem, and it's not addressed.
It's not quite right.
Okay, so let's get into this now, really the question that's been raised about individual choice versus the role of government. But to come to you on this, Bonnie, first, in terms of, how much should be on the individual here, you're someone who clearly kind of believes in the role of individuals and the role of communities, but where do you see companies and the government fitting into this, and what responsibility do they have?
Yeah, obviously I believe deeply in the power of our individual actions, having just written a book entirely about individual action. But throughout the entirety of the book, I always show that it is a dual approach that we have to take. And at the end of the book, in the conclusion, I say that individual action is just the beginning. It's not the end, and it's all very, well, again, talking about access of just free time to sort of to educate ourselves around this, or go out of our way to make sort of more sustainable choices. Can ebb and flow as our capacity can change according to what's happening in our life. So, individual actions sometimes are quite hard to keep sort of on a good level throughout your entire life, because things happen in the world, prices go up, jobs, could go away. Everything is hard to keep at a sort of level, but when you look at the power of policy and funding, that, if we, believe in sort of society and democracy, is really the most freeing way that people can be given and liberated from being put in a pinch to make a choice over, paying a utility bill and like buying some nice vegetables to sit down and cook themselves a meal that is an act of care, that, and like I agree with the point you just made, like talking really about like feeding ourselves well, not just looking at the base minimum of feeding ourselves, because we're also, food affects and everything within our wellness of just our mental capacity to show up to work, to show up to the things that we could be thriving to do as individuals. And it feels like it's sad to think that we're only limiting this discussion to, whilst yes having a good harvest, but like then the journey of that harvest to our plate and our relationship and our experience to it. You don't want food to only exist as this kind of like getting myself fed and getting through the day. It's actually a very highly nutritious form of energy that we could be lacking in other elements of our life. So yeah, I don't know where I'm leading with my point, but essentially individual action can only take you so far. And also we shouldn't be asked this much of ourselves sometimes as individuals.
I'd like to have Victoria and Henry comment on this, but first I'm being told that we're being joined, I think, by Patrick Holden, possibly with some mud on his boots. Do we have Patrick?
Oh.
Patrick, welcome. Tell us where you're joining us from.
I'm joining you from Scotland, but I'm actually a dairy farmer and a cheesemaker from Wales. And, sorry.
No. Better last way.
Yeah, whatever you've done, undo it, please.
Are we live now?
We are. This thing is on.
Okay, so I'm a dairy farmer and a cheesemaker, and I've been farming sustainably for nearly 50 years. And last week we produced this report, which Henry Dimbleby has seen, Feeding Britain from the Ground Up. And it relates to the eating well point, because it's not just about eating food. I mean, so much of the food that is grown today, especially the vegetables that are sold in supermarkets, are massively lower in nutritional composition than they were, say, 40 or 50 years ago. So what this report does is it models a UK-wide transition to truly sustainable farming, and it looks at the food output, and then it divides that food output by 70 million people, which is what we're projecting the population will be in the next census. And it works out whether we can maintain our current levels of food security. And the answer is we could, but only if we ate very, very differently. We'd have to give up eating cheap chicken because grain production would decline by 50%. And instead, we'd have to eat lots of vegetables and fruit, of course, but also grass-fed and mainly grass-fed beef and lamb, which is very much against what people like George Monbiot are saying, who he's saying we should go out of livestock farming altogether and eat lab meat or synthetic protein, that sort of thing. So I think the surprising conclusion of this report needs to be considered in this debate about how Britain should feed itself. And as far as I know, a report of this scale hasn't really been produced since Kenneth Mellenby wrote a book called Can Britain Feed Itself in 1975. So we hope this will open a discussion. We haven't necessarily got it 100% right, and Henry doesn't agree with every sentence of it, but I think we've done our research.
Is Henry's face visible to you, Patrick? I wonder. Okay, we're going to come now. I think we should come now to Victoria, because I think there are a few questions coming in your direction. And I think, can you just help us on the sort of politics of this, Victoria? Because it's obviously very complicated. It's really, it's literally visceral, isn't it? What's on our plates.
And that's why it's often felt in affordability terms, because it's the decision we make 2 or 3 times a day.
Yeah.
And we don't make the decision about rent or fuel 3 times a day, but food, well, certainly in my case, you feel the need for it very regularly.
Yeah. So if you were going to make the political argument in favour of a salt tax, for example, where do you begin with that? And where do you begin with that with your colleagues?
I think it's easy. Well, as ever, with food and diet, it's all about balance, isn't it? And some things work really well through taxation. So, for example, the fizzy drink tax, just looking at the ones on the table right there.
Very, very healthy.
There's good ones.
Yeah.
It was interesting that the way that government used its levers led to real reformulation and 40-something% reductions in the amount of sugar. Absolutely brilliant, a good win. But not everything is as full of sugar as some cans of soda were, and that isn't always going to work. So one of the great ideas that came out of our food strategy, and indeed Henry's work for the department over the last couple of years, isn't sexy at all, but is going to make real change. And this is this concept of food data and transparency collection, which I know doesn't sound interesting, but it is the way to get industry to work with government to reformulate. That it is perfectly possible to make real change through voluntary work with industry, not always, but sometimes. One good example of that is on breakfast cereals and yogurts, where we have worked with industry and got a 16% reduction in the sugar available in those products. That is progress. It may not be everything we want to do, but it is real progress. And I think, particularly at the moment, when the whole affordability issue is so high on everybody's agenda, we need to be really careful what and how we're asking processors and retailers to work with government to come to the best solutions. This is a really difficult time for people. Affording things is difficult. And yes, absolutely, I agree with almost everything that's been said about long-term change and the need for that, and helping children to understand food in different ways and to learn how to cook food. But we have to accept that people don't necessarily have the energy, physical or mental or brain space, to do that cooking from scratch in the way that we'd love them to.
Okay, I'd like to hear from Henry on this, but first to take some comments. There was a gentleman at the back there with his hands raised, but first I think the lady there has the mic. Yep.
Okay, I just want to take issue with this very easy fix of sugar tax. Of course we want to reduce the amount of sugar that people consume. It's toxic. The minute you eat sugar, your immune system takes a hit. But what the companies do is replace sugar with poisonous sweeteners, aspartame, for example, which are carcinogenic and are just as harmful as the sugar. And also, it's based on a misunderstanding of how the endocrine system works.
Okay. This may not be the place for the endocrine system just yet, but we'll come to it when we have drinks later.
So when you put something sweet on your tongue, it sends a message to the brain which says, sugar's coming, release insulin.
Right.
Whether that is actual sugar or whether it's aspartame, it still floods the system with insulin. So whether or not you're drinking or eating sugar or just aspartame, you are starting yourself on the diabetic cycle because you're flooding the body with insulin, which then imbalances that system.
All right, let's have another comment. There was a gentleman in the back in the black shirt. If we can get a mic to you.
Hello everyone, I'm Kais, originally from Afghanistan. When it comes to healthier and nutritious food and its connection to trade, as well as how the UK could help poorer countries such as Afghanistan, while also importing really nutritious vegetables and fruits, for instance pomegranates. Afghanistan got one of the best pomegranates in the world, and very delicious and juicy, by the way, from developing countries in general. And also, it will not only help the UK have a cheaper and more healthier food market, but also help the local economy within those poorer countries through trade. So how the policy would work if it puts in place.
Okay, thank you, Kais. Henry, I'd like to come back to you on the politics of food and response to Victoria's point on salt.
And so the question started with one over here saying, like, what can companies do? So the answer is companies on the environment can do quite a lot. They can make money selling environmentally friendly food. I don't think government can do much on meat. I think books like Bonnie's, just changing minds, very difficult. The political the ability for the government to make us eat less meat, people hate it.
Yeah.
On health, companies can't do anything on their own. They can't because they will lose money, and if they lose money, they'll get fired and someone else will sell the food. So there is what I call a junk food cycle. There's a toxic interaction between our evolved appetite, which makes us seek out calorie-dense food, which when it's low in fibre, we satiate less, we eat more before we get full. And they have spotted that, not because they're wicked and they try and kill us, but they spotted that if they spend more money on marketing and selling that stuff, we eat more, they sell more, we eat more, and we get sick. And the only way that you are going to break that junk food cycle is in intervening to make it commercially less attractive for those companies to sell that food. Almost every CEO of the big food companies will admit that in private, some won't. Not one will say it publicly because they would get fired by their boards for doing that. So we have a really interesting situation coming up in 2 or 3 weeks' time when the Health Secretary is going to publish his Health Disparities White Paper. As I understand it, he understands the problem. As I understand it, he wants to do something quite bold. He will face significant, initially passive-aggressive word changes from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who will be trying to protect the advertisers. So they will say we can't bring back the restrictions on advertising to kids. 80% of the population think that junk food companies shouldn't be able to market to kids, and yet DCMS will try and block that. And David Canzini in number 10 will try and block anything that interferes with the free market. So it'll be fascinating to see. And also at the same time, if I was Sajid Javid, I would not want to be trying to intervene on this space when I was effective in a proxy leadership campaign for the Tory party, because those interventions are not going to be very popular with the electoral base that he's trying to attract to become Prime Minister. So we're in on this a fascinating period with a clever, determined Secretary of State who, as I understand, wants to be bold but has very significant headwinds against him. So it'll be very interesting to see what version comes out in the end.
At this point, that we did accept the concept of the junk food, the junk food cycle in the food paper that we
that was
published.
massive. So massive step forward. That was.
I think that was a step forward. We didn't, and there was considerable opposition to us putting those words, your words, and other people's words in that document. But I think it is important that we recognise the way that we're being encouraged to eat. But I also think it's important that we are quite grounded in the real world, and we recognise that this is not, there are no quick wins for this. This is a very difficult problem to fix.
Henry, if I'm paraphrasing Victoria correctly, I mean, the cost of living crisis matters, doesn't it? It's with us. That's a reasonable argument, isn't it?
Well, on some things it is.
On
some
some
so I've
things,
actually
exactly,
said the sugar and salt tax, and I do think your concerns about it are right. I'm not sure I agree with you on the conclusion, but the concern, that is definitely the worry about it. I don't think that's politically doable now, even if you had a government. Interestingly, we did, with one of the Tory party's own people who does their focus groups and research, we did research on all of our recommendations, and they felt that a government with a good amount of political capital at that time would have been able to get away with, would be able to do that. The government doesn't have quite as much political capital as it had back then, thanks to Partygate, and in a cost of living crisis, I think even a government with a lot of political capital would find that hard. However, advertising will reduce the cost of food. In fact, one of the arguments the advertisers, the junk food people make to government about advertising is, oh, if you stop us advertising, we'll just make the food cheaper, and then people will eat more of it. Like, so advertising, there are still interventions that they can make to show, you have to wait for the right moment. Sometimes you look at George Osborne with the sugary drinks levy. He did it during the budget because you don't have this right around process on the budget, etc. So we may have to wait for firmer interventions, but it is important there are significant interventions that the government has already said they will do. At a minimum, they must be doing that, and I'd like to see what they're planning to go further than those things they've already said they'll do.
Okay, I'd like to bring in some more comments at this point. There are some in the room, but there's also, I think, Bruce Davis, if we have him on Zoom. Can we come to you, Bruce, if you're still with us?
Yep, I'm still here. Hi there. So I think it was a sort of slightly different tangent, I guess, agreeing about the there is this barrier that we've got around food, which is basically emotional and cultural, and that stops some of the change. But some of the things we've been doing, so we spent 10 years funding renewable energy. We're now funding new forms of food production, but we're sort of running into the same barriers we did on renewable energy, which is that shifting the locus of food production into vertical farms, into glass houses, doing that in a sustainable way, it disrupts communities and it disrupts what we think about food. And I think that there needs to be sort of,
We've lost you. Sorry, Bruce. Let's come back to the room. There were 3 questions, I think, in the room. The lady at the front first.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk about a topic that kind of goes a little away from eating well, so feel free to come back to it later. But I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, and it's the topic of food waste, because I think it greatly relates to production, to supply chains, to companies, but also to your individual relationship with food. And I used to work for a really great company, Too Good To Go, that have kind of managed to integrate like a financially sustainable solution where you can pick up the food that would have been thrown away at the end of the day for like a third of the price. And my question to you is, do you think that these kind of initiatives have a way of being scaled up to policy, to government level? Like, what do you think the role of food waste is in addressing this question? Thank you.
Thanks. Great question. Gentleman in the blue shirt and then the lady in the pink T-shirt there.
Hi, Peter from Piper's Farm. Could Victoria give us a little bit of an insight into discussions which might go on in Department of Education about how really vitally important it is for our young children to start on this process of properly understanding the importance of food, and as Bonnie said, how it will impact on everything in their life, their well-being and everything else. So is that something that Department of Education really genuinely understand, or is it just not on the agenda?
Okay, and the lady in the pink T-shirt there, and then we'll come back to the question at the front. Do you have a mic?
Is this working? Yeah. My name's Orla. I'm from Sustain. We're Food and Farming Alliance. So, Minister, thank you for joining us. My question is about school meals. And especially during lockdown, the government got itself into an awful lot of trouble because it had to be pressed repeatedly to sort out free school meals and holiday hunger. And I think it probably spends quite a lot of money at the moment means testing children for whether or not they can eat. Wouldn't it just be simpler to give them free school meals?
Great question. And finally, a comment at the front.
Thank you. Hi, no one knows me here, but you and you. I'm Joy. I have a question. So about school meals as well. So ever since I was like tiny, the school everyone's just not really eating our school meals, and we've they're terrible. They're absolutely terrible. And my best friend Cece, she doesn't really find a point in going up and eating them because she just throws it in the bin immediately. And we do this thing. We kind of say our opinions, but the school meals really hasn't changed. So I'm kind of I'm asking when there's going to be like a change in the school meals to listen to what the kids have to say.
Thank you, Victoria.
Those were a great bunch of questions because they all go together so well. So we're talking about school meals being yummy or not, and we're talking about food waste when they're not yummy and they're not appreciated. And the lady from Sustain was talking about whether or not they should be targeted or universal. And another good question about how important it is and how significant it is, how significant government thinks it is to make sure that children get access to really good food at a really young age. So I used to teach 4-year-olds cookery, which was wild. But really good fun, just as an extra job after school, you know, just one of those after school clubs. And I learned lots from that. I learned that children really like smelling things and touching things and squidging things and making a mess and then eating all the way through the process continually, whatever it is that you have available to you. So I think it's absolutely right that children are programmed to be really interested in food if we enable and encourage them to have that fascination. I think during the pandemic, to go to your question, we learnt quite a lot about working across government on food issues. So I chaired this task force called Feeding the Vulnerable. And frankly, we did things that we'd never dreamt of before, because we had a whole bunch of people that couldn't leave home to get food. So we had to get food to them, which is not the way that we'd worked previously. We also thought of some good interventions, and I was really pleased with the holiday. It's called the HAF Fund, which is a way of getting children active in the holidays. These are particularly low-income children, and then also eating good food. It was part of the actual feeding intervention as well that we did. But in the best HAF programmes, also cooking that food and learning about that food. There is definitely more that we can do in that space. And in the Levelling Up white paper, and I think it's quite interesting that it is in this big flagship Levelling Up white paper, there is a section on school food that I definitely refer you to. It's pilots at the moment, so it's the beginnings, but it is the beginnings. And we are still doing a lot of that cross-government work that started during the pandemic. Cross-government, and I've got the Children's Minister is very heavily involved, and we meet regularly to talk about this, and I think that's really important. And I don't want to take up time. The food waste side is very important, not necessarily going to be the answer for everybody on a very limited budget, because there is very little food waste in those households, but I think for the rest of us, absolutely, and I think the retailers are really leaning into this and making sure that they use that food properly. And I'd refer anybody that doesn't know about them to WRAP, W-R-A-P, who are a fab organisation.
School meals, not an area where the government's covered itself in glory,
well, is it? They've increased them recently to children without recourse to public funds, which is clearly the right thing to do. There's a big theological debate that we have not got time to have about whether interventions are best targeted or universal. I learnt during the pandemic from that group that targeted was the way to go when public budgets are very tight. And we've just heard from a user that not all school meals are exactly what we might want them to be, or are appreciated in a way we might want them to be. But I think the government is open-minded, actually, and is willing to continue to work on this.
Okay.
Can I say something very, very brief on that? So the issue that really does need to be resolved urgently is the free school meals cost and and who it's available to. So it's £2.30. It's been that for ages. That's now worth that's been that for years. That's now worth 10% less than it was a year ago. And you have many more people falling into the bracket. In England, the hurdle for free school meals is £7,400 pre-benefits. You have to earn less than that. It's almost half what it is in Northern Ireland. It's more in Scotland. So that, the government keeps saying they're looking at that at the moment. They need to look at that. I know that needs to be. They need to.
Another really exciting thing from the food strategy
Victoria,
is.
let me just
stop
you if I can. Just bring there's a lady very patiently there, and we're almost at time, so I'd like to bring her in. Do we have a mic for you, or if you can just shout out? Yeah.
I'm Stephanie Slater from School Food Matters,
Oh, hello.
clue in the name here. It's interesting to know that government is reviewing the issue around eligibility, and we can continue to talk about universalism, which has to be the ambition, I feel. But the immediate first step has to be able to make meals available to the 1 in 3 children who are living in poverty but still don't qualify for a free school meal. It has to happen now. We can't wait. And I'm so excited about the HAF programme, but remember that it's for those that are entitled for free school meals. So still tons of children are missing out on this opportunity for good nutrition. So I really say, let's continue the debate about universalism, why we means testing this, why we means testing children to eat a good nutrition. But right now, we need to support those children who are missing out on good nutrition today.
And the gentleman in the blue jumper. If you,
Just shout.
Yeah, just shout.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Adam Briggs, I'm a public health doctor and academic. I think
Well, we've got a mic coming to you now.
Oh, brilliant.
There we go.
Thank you. So, I mean, the conclusion is that the whole thing is complex. There's no single solution to the food system and its current challenges. The evidence tells us that population-level interventions, so interventions that affect everybody, things like taxes, things like regulation on marketing, etc., that people don't need much agency to engage with, i.e. you don't have to make a decision, a conscious decision to be impacted by it, such as not being exposed to an advert, are going to be both more effective and more equitable in terms of having outcomes. Similarly, we know that our food system doesn't incorporate the externalities, the hidden costs to poor health, to the environment as it currently stands. These are things that are they're known and they're evidence-led, okay? So if we take away the political value system that underpins that and actually talk about what opportunities we can have from a healthy, sustainable food system, the opportunity to a healthy life, the opportunity to a sustainable planet, is that not a better way of marketing and messaging what we're trying to achieve here with a food system that gets beyond the politics and allows the kind of cross-party consensus we're going to have to be able to get to the really hard decisions we need to make moving forward on trade legislation, on taxation, on what choices we get about what meat and what dairy we can eat. They are choices that are coming our way hard and fast. And if we can get beyond the political value rhetoric, I think actually we can maybe make some traction. A lot of that is going to be around framing and how we have a national conversation.
So one of the elements of this conversation feels like the gap between what governments and companies can do, what individuals can do. And Bonnie, I want to come to you on this. I mean, is there a space for activism here? And what's, how do you see that shaping up over the next year or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't want to, as an individual, feel like the government are only going to intervene if there's a crisis or you're like raising your hand in emergency. You want to believe that is there for you to go to, even if you aren't means tested, to mean that you can access it. And, all of these topics, obviously, for so many people in this room, like, they're so complex. And, it gets me so angry and it gets me so riled up and it gets me so empowered too to turn to activism, to continue this work. And the complexity of these things, as you've suggested, like rather than just kind of using kind of policy and government to kind of keep everything at a level okay, like it's okay, it's fine, we're like secure, but we're not like actually thriving and happy. How can we maybe, as we're taking funding or money away from the advertising of junk food, how can we actually like celebrate and amplify living healthily? Like why are we not kind of looking at language that actually can be abundant and not about like stripping away and taking out, and actually really looking at ourselves and those around us and how we're using language to genuinely like affect people's lives, not just money and not just funding, but actually, and why education to me is so important, and not just educating people to be able to cook themselves a meal, but maybe they're interested to even find a job in agriculture. Like that could be something that they could learn in that lesson at 4 years old,
I think,
rather than needing to necessarily bring in, so much trade from other country. Like, I am sure people are finding generations of farmers just kind of not dropping off because we're not celebrating, like, as we kind of clap for the NHS during the crisis, like I was kind of like, what about the people growing our food as well? So yeah, I think to me it's all about how we can use better language and more abundant language so that we're living to our potential and not just like only getting it in a crisis.
One of the themes of this evening really is there are some things that only government can do and only business can do, but it's really nice to be reminded that food is also a pleasure and it's also an enthusiasm and it's something that we can galvanise people to do something about. I think we've seen a lot of that energy in this room tonight. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Bonnie, Henry, Victoria. Brilliant discussion. Thanks so much.